Welcome to the Optimal Protein Podcast. I'm Vanessa Spina. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Vanessa, and I am so excited for today's episode because we have Kristi Storoschuk joining us today. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Muscle Physiology Lab at Queen's University, studying exercise, metabolic health, and mitochondrial function. We talk a lot on this episode specifically about metabolic flexibility, mitochondrial health, and how we can actually achieve these metabolic adaptations. And it may not actually be what you believed it to be, as I certainly learned that the definition that I believed metabolic flexibility to be is slightly different than what it actually is according to the science. And we really talk in depth about that today. We also talk about Kristi's approach and her diet, what she does personally, and how she approaches ketosis, low carb diets, high protein, how she approaches enhancing her own metabolic health and mitochondrial function, intermittent fasting, and so many of my favorite topics, as well as some of the geekier, more in-depth scientific discussions, and always bringing it back to key takeaway messages that you can apply and utilize in your life right now. Kristi is currently doing some fascinating research that involves determining how much of a fat burner you can be at the mitochondrial level and using lactate as a proxy for that. So it's so much fun to talk to her about all of these topics and really do a deep dive today on what metabolic flexibility really is. And I'm so excited for you all to tune in to this episode today. I am doing a giveaway contest for you to enter to win a red light therapy panel, actually the Diamond Red Light Therapy panel from the Tone Luxe collection. That is the beauty panel. It's designed to use on the face, and it has the perfect size to use on the face to help boost collagen and elastin in the face. And red light therapy is one of only a couple of science-backed ways to help boost the collagen and elastin in your skin and help keep the youthfulness and beauty of your face. So I'm a big advocate of red light therapy, and you also get systemic benefits from cell-free mitochondria that circulate through your body. So you can enter to win by leaving me a podcast review and sending a screenshot of that review to giveaway@ketogenicgirl.com. If you have already left a review for the podcast, you can update it with some new information, maybe something new that you love about the podcast or a new guest or topic that you've enjoyed, and you can take a screenshot of that and also send it in to giveaway@ketogenicgirl.com, and it will count as one entry towards this giveaway contest. So I love doing product giveaways. I'm trying to do at least one per quarter, and I asked you all which product you wanted to be in the giveaway, and you said the Diamond Red Light Therapy panel. So that is the one that we are doing. You can check it out if you'd like to see it at ketogenicgirl.com and enter to win by leaving a podcast review on iTunes of this podcast and send a screenshot to giveaway@ketogenicgirl.com. I can't wait to see who wins the giveaway contest and am super excited for you all. So wishing you good luck to win. So with a quick break, we will dive right into today's episode. I am so excited to tell you about this incredible company that I discovered while doing research on the mitochondria. Now, my dear friend, Dr. Gabrielle Line, is a huge fan of Timeline Nutrition, and she is my muscle health and strength guru. So this is a Swiss-based life science company, and they did 10 years of research on this compound they discovered called urolithin A. It is a powerful postbiotic that is nearly impossible to get just from your diet alone. So we all know about autophagy, and autophagy of our mitochondria is called mitophagy. Timeline created a product called MitoPure, which is clinically shown to give our cellular energy generators, our mitochondria, new power by triggering the body's natural process for removing and rebuilding damaged mitochondria, which is mitophagy. So you could think of MitoPure as little Pac-Man in your cells that are gobbling up the damaged mitochondria that can make you feel old and tired, and recycling it into pristine, new, healthy mitochondria. So our mitochondria are a key influence in how we age, and mitochondrial efficiency naturally declines over the years. So this creates a large gap in our quality of life that we expect to have in our later years and what we can actually experience. So with MitoPure, you can actually help renew your mitochondria and improve mitochondrial function. In addition to all the ways that you do it with resistance training, endurance exercise, eating a healthy whole foods diet, and prioritizing protein, this is probably the number one supplement out there. It has the scientific research behind it, and it is absolutely incredible. So Timeline is generously offering our listeners 10% off your first order of MitoPure if you go to timeline.com/Vanessa. That's timeline.com/Vanessa, and you can get 10% off Timeline. I am obsessed with this supplement. It takes a lot for me to include a new supplement into my routine, and this combined with collagen and hyaluronic acid really has the science behind it, showing that it is effective in helping us to boost that mitophagy, that autophagy of our mitochondria. And I can't think of any supplement on the market that does anything close to this. So if you want to invest in your mitochondrial health, try MitoPure and invest in the science, invest in yourself today. All right. Well, Kristi, welcome to the Optimal Protein Podcast. How are you doing this morning?
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great, working from home today, which is always a treat. So I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I was just telling you, I've been really looking forward to this conversation with you. And I was, just as going through your background and everything, I was like, you were like a ketogenic girl. So like, maybe not anymore, but like also a former ketogenic girl. Like it's just amazing. You were like Dr. Dom D'Agostino's mentee, and you got to do all this amazing work with him, and you were studying ketones and fasting and all this stuff. So that's really, really amazing. And what first got you interested in ketogenesis? Like just back when you were first started getting into everything?
Yeah. So my journey into this health world started really young. My grandparents owned a health food shop. We sold supplements and some natural health foods. And so I was kind of exposed to the natural health world at a very young age. And I knew I wanted to go into something within this field. Initially, I wanted to go into naturopathic medicine. So I did my undergrad in botany, which happened to be like a pre-natural medicine route. And so I have a plant science degree, which sounds funny now that I'm in exercise physiology. However, it was always with the same goals in mind. And then when I graduated, I decided naturopathic medicine really wasn't for me, and I wanted to go into research. And so I was really interested in nutrition growing up, and the ketogenic diet really spoke to me because it was the only diet you could track a biomarker with. And there was actual like mechanisms and biochemistry involved. And I always really loved genetics and biochemistry. So the idea of being able to study something physiological and follow that in your body, like you can't do that with a vegan diet or a paleo diet or something. There's no biomarker to track. You're just trusting that someone's following it. Whereas a ketogenic diet, if someone's following a ketogenic diet, it's defined by a biomarker. So that was always really interesting to me. So I wanted to go into research, studying ketones and ketogenic diet. And so I reached out to essentially like all the profs that I knew around North America that were studying ketones and ketogenic nutrition. Dom D'Agostino happened to respond to my email, and he wasn't looking for students at the time, but he was looking to expand his own social media platforms and his blog. And so he asked me if I wanted to take that role, start writing for him, and kind of just like work under him naturally and figure out like what we could do together. So I kind of rode that wave for about 4 years, just working for him. And I was exposed to research in his lab. I got to go on some of their like NASA research projects, and just it was really an amazing experience volunteering research wise with them, but then also working in science communication and learning through science communication. But then eventually I was like, okay, Kristi, you got to go back to school. Like your initial plans were always to go get a graduate degree. I'm from Ontario, Canada. So I ended up applying to a PhD program here in Ontario at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And what drew me to this program was the study of mitochondrial function. So of course, with a background of ketones, ketone metabolism, low carb diets, mitochondria come up a lot. So I was really drawn to this lab, which was an exercise physiology lab that studies mitochondrial function, just because I knew the link between mitochondrial function and metabolic health. And so it sounded like a great fit for me. So anyways, I started my PhD in 2021, I think. And I'm hopefully going to be wrapping up in the next year or so. So that's where I'm at now. And that's how it started. But my research background and what got me here was definitely working under the wing of Dr. D'Agostino, which we still connect. I actually just got off a call with him right before this. So I'm still really connected with him, and he's an amazing person and human being. And I'm just so grateful for all the opportunities he's given me, because I definitely would not be in this position without him. So both from an academic journey and just a personal development, he's played a big role in my life. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that sounds like my dream journey. So I'm so happy that you got to experience that. I mean, he literally is the kindest human, one of the kindest humans I've ever come across, and just so many accomplishments. And he is so generous with his time and mentorship and everything. And it's amazing. That's really nice that you guys still have, close relationship. And I'm sure you just learned so much. And you were getting to write on my favorite blog, ketonutrition.org, which is like it's got to be my favorite blog on the internet. It's just amazing. And that's so cool. That's awesome. Lots of the articles that I refer to all the time and read, I think you authored or co-authored with Dom on there. So that's really cool. That's such a cool job. And so now you're doing your PhD. By the way, where in Ontario? I was born in Ottawa.
Oh, no way. Yeah. That's so funny. I live in Prince Edward County,
okay,
but I commute into Kingston. So it's about an hour commute. Yeah.
Nice.
But close to Ottawa. That's
my parents still live in Ottawa. Most of my family's still out there.
Well, then we definitely have to connect.
Yeah, that would be great. That's really, really neat. So then you started doing work on your PhD, which is what you're doing currently. And thank you for making the time for doing this in the middle of that, because it's a lot.
Of course. I love this opportunity. Yeah. So I'm under the supervision of Dr. Brendan Gerd. So like I said, our lab studies mitochondrial adaptations to endurance exercise. And so it's been a super humbling experience. I'm so glad that I ended up taking the leap into academia, because I don't think, even if I wanted a career in science communication, I don't think I would have the inherent ability to understand research without necessarily doing it myself. And not that the alternative isn't possible, but I think that for me, it's really been a critical experience for me. And I know that it's going to advance whatever I end up doing next. So our lab is very diverse. All the members in our lab are kind of studying very different things, despite having the same supervisor and the same access to all the equipment that we use. So me particularly, I'm looking at adaptations to high intensity interval training in the fed or the fasted state. So that's my current study going on right now that I'm hopefully going to be wrapping up very soon. So I don't really have any results to share because I'm still in the midst of data collection. And then I'll be looking at the correlation between mitochondrial function, lactate accumulation during exercise, and metabolic health, and kind of triangulating those three factors and seeing if our lactate levels at a certain exercise intensity are an indirect marker of mitochondrial function across age and fitness status. So that's my next study. And then hopefully that'll be all the data collection I need for my dissertation. Like my whole thesis is really related to lactate and the determinants of lactate threshold and just why we're accumulating lactate at a certain intensity and what that has to do with our mitochondria within our skeletal muscle. So we're really lucky that we have access to muscle biopsies. So I have a ton of stored muscle tissue right now sitting in liquid nitrogen that eventually I will get to and run a lot of analysis on and look at certain proteins and being able to assess mitochondrial function in actual skeletal muscle samples.
Yeah, I laughed out loud when I heard you on an interview saying that your study participants preferred getting their muscle biopsies than doing the actual exercise prevention because it was so brutal. I was like, whoa.
Yesterday, I actually had someone throw up. I felt really bad.
Oh my God. Yeah, is that an adverse event or?
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh man. Yeah. That sounds like really, truly fascinating work though. And so cool and exciting. I'm so excited about where we are right now in research and the science that we're learning right now. And I just think we're like on the cusp of some major findings. So it'd be great to define metabolic flexibility and mitochondrial biogenesis. I think metabolic flexibility is the term I'd really love to focus on because we can talk about what you've sort of discovered are some of the best ways to increase metabolic flexibility at the level of the mitochondria. But it's a term that's used so much and thrown around so much. And I know that you've like really gotten specific on what that means. And it would be really helpful for listeners, I think.
Yeah, the like initial studies that kind of define metabolic flexibility are using like the RQ of our leg, which is looking at the fuel substrate utilization of our skeletal muscle of our leg. And so in response to fasting, which should be reliant on fatty acid oxidation, we should be able to increase fat oxidation. And then in response to a glucose bolus, then we should increase carbohydrate oxidation. And that kind of transition is inherent to humans. We should have that metabolic flexibility where under conditions that we rely on fat, so both going from rest to exercise and then going from the postprandial to the fasted state, we increase fat oxidation, or we should. And we should have the capacity to do that. But we should also have the capacity to switch to glucose oxidation and increase carbohydrate oxidation in response to insulin and higher glucose availability. So carbohydrate intake. And that's how I think of metabolic flexibility. So just that fluid transition from fat to carbohydrate, depending on the environmental status of your body. And I think that is what the scientific definition of metabolic flexibility is. But my views on metabolic flexibility have changed because I used to think of going into the fasted state, like going in and out of ketosis, as something that promotes metabolic flexibility. And I'm less convinced. I think I'm leaning more towards that just being a response versus an adaptation. And so going into ketosis is also an inherent physiological state that humans should inherently have. And so maybe not being able to go into ketosis or having trouble burning fat and stuff, that is a marker of being not metabolically flexible, but using ketosis or using fasting as a way to adapt and improve metabolic flexibility, I'm less convinced of, just because of how our skeletal muscle is determining our metabolic flexibility. And then what I know about what promotes adaptations in our muscles, which is exercise. And so I'm just really in the camp of exercise being the only real physiological condition that we're going to promote the pathways and adaptations that would improve metabolic flexibility. But I think you can still improve insulin sensitivity through like diet induced weight loss without exercise. But whether that improves metabolic flexibility, I don't think you could improve both fat oxidative capacity and insulin sensitivity, which are like the two spectrums of metabolic flexibility, without exercise. I think you can improve insulin sensitivity through diet alone. But if you want to improve metabolic flexibility, you need exercise as well to get that fat oxidation spectrum.
Yeah, and that's such an important distinction, I think, between the two. If you think of someone who's metabolically inflexible, and then you work back from that. So then you're talking about someone who's maybe locked into only burning glucose, like they're just sugar burners, they can't burn fat. So then for that person to be able to tap into their stored body fat means that they're becoming more metabolically flexible, right?
Yeah. Or maybe they can tap into their body fat. It's just that their skeletal muscle isn't taking up those fatty acids, or their muscles don't have a reason to burn them. So they just circulate and then get re-esterified, and you're just not doing anything with the fats because you want your organs to be burning it. But if your energy expenditure isn't requiring you to burn anything, then you are just going to have it accumulating in your blood and then restoring it. And
that makes so much sense. So you need to create, those adaptations to become more metabolically flexible at the mitochondrial level through the exercise. Whereas if you just use ketosis, either through nutrition or fasting, then you're not really developing metabolic flexibility so much as you're just taking away the carbs. And so you're not like testing your ability to be able to switch back and forth. You're just limiting yourself to being able to burn fat. I think it's a really like small distinction, like it's kind of, but it's really, I think it really makes a lot of sense when you're talking about these definitions. It's frustrating when, you read papers and definitions are used very loosely, or they're not using the same, like there's no universal definition sometimes for things, especially in this space. So I think it's really important to have those definitions there to help people understand more what's actually going on. Because at the end of the day, if you do want to improve your metabolic flexibility, you're going to improve your mitochondria's ability to burn more fat. You want it to be something sustainable, and that you're actually developing, like you're leveling up your mitochondria, which you're not actually doing through ketosis. It's the exercise that's doing that, which is what you're saying. And I think that makes so much sense.
I will add to that. I was just like picturing things as you were saying them. And our mitochondrial capacity, we already have the capacity to burn fat at rest. So we're not actually like putting a stress on our mitochondria by increasing fat oxidation at rest. Like we already have enough mitochondria. We have a capacity already to do that. So our mitochondria don't get any sort of signal that they need to proliferate. And to get to your question about mitochondrial biogenesis, it's just the definition. It's really just the expansion of the mitochondrial reticulum. So just increasing the expression of mitochondrial proteins that eventually get incorporated into growing the mitochondrial reticulum. It's not necessarily increasing content. It could be expanding the actual existing mitochondria, or it could be causing the proliferation and increasing content as well. But that's all part of the reticulum.
So just to recap a little bit on what we've just been talking about. So it sounds like you can lose weight and improve your insulin sensitivity through perhaps fasting, intermittent fasting, caloric restriction obtained through these different protocols. But you're really getting mainly those two benefits, like fat loss, improving insulin sensitivity. But in terms of the adaptations where you're actually leveling up your mitochondria, so to speak, that really is coming from exercise. And whether you do that fasted or not is not as important for the metabolic flexibility and the benefits on the mitochondria in terms of mitochondrial biogenesis, or growing the mitochondria's reticulum.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to say concretely that it doesn't matter if you're in the fasted or fed state, because I think that there's still a lot to know. There are some studies showing like greater AMPK activation in the fasted state versus the fed state, or greater PGC1 alpha expression. So it is possible that we are getting more adaptations doing endurance style exercise in the fasted state. I think we just need to we need way more studies to just clarify what's going on and being able to make sense of all these small studies. Because in exercise science, all these studies are like 12 to 15, sometimes less people. My study right now I'm recruiting 50 participants, so I'm hoping that it's more of a robust sample. But yeah, we're relying on very small sample sizes. I mean, the tides are changing, but there's a lot of bias within exercise science, not deliberate, but there's just the way the experimental protocols are done. It does introduce some bias into the study. So exercise science, I think, is improving as a field, and we're becoming more aware of these external factors that might be influencing some of the results. But anyways, moral of that story, that's beyond this conversation. But yes, I think that doing exercise is the most important thing, whether you do it fasted or fed, isn't going to deter you from the benefits or adaptations from exercise, but there's a potential benefit to doing endurance style exercise in the fasted state. And yes, exercise being the only physiological condition that we're going to promote mitochondrial adaptation in skeletal muscle.
Perfect. Thank you for recapping that. It's really helpful. I was interviewing your colleague, Dr. Tommy Wood. He recommended that, I connected with you and spoke very highly of you and your research. And we were talking a little bit about quantifying autophagy in humans in exercise versus fasting. And so that was, I think, one of the big mind-blowing moments I had in talking to him was when he said that you can get equivalent amounts of autophagy from a 30-minute workout resistance training as from a 3-day fast. And I think quantifying terms in autophagy like that is so helpful for people who are out there doing the 3-day fast, thinking that it is giving them more autophagy than a 30-minute bout of exercise. Specifically, I would way rather do 30-minute or 40-minute weight workout than fast for 3 days. So it's really useful information. And when we can access science more directly instead of waiting for, decades for it to be published and then interpreted for us by other media and then eventually reach us. It's so exciting. So I know you've done some really interesting research, and I think there's more research that you're doing in human models. So that's sort of what the initial research that I was looking at, a lot of it was Dr. Mark Madsen. A lot of it was like mice, rodent models. And it turns out that some of the pathways that trigger the AMPK pathway or energetic crises at the cell are very different for humans than in rodents, right? Is that sort of one of the things that you learned in your research?
Right. Yeah. And I just want to back up and say that Tommy, similar to Dom, has played a major mentorship role in my life as well. And I'm super grateful for his friendship and him being a colleague and mentor. So yeah, super honored that he brought me up on the podcast with you. That was really cool. Tommy's great. But yes, so you're referring to a systematic review that I published at the end of last year. So essentially this whole impetus came from, I joined the lab that I'm in and I would sit down with my supervisor and I wanted to study fasting because fasting is championed as this energetic stress that would activate these, like you said, these energetic stress pathways that should lead to adaptations that make us more resilient, and these certain genes that are associated with longevity and health and greater mitochondrial function and just overall vitality and overall wellness. So I was under the impression that fasting was an energetic stress and that it would lead to the activation of these pathways. And so knowing that I had access to the equipment that we needed to study mitochondrial function, I really wanted to do some fasting studies. But the more I chatted with my supervisor and the more we kind of tried to figure out study protocols, the more we realized that these pathways are not necessarily activated in human skeletal muscle. And when it comes to like why we want good mitochondria, I mean, I'm biased because I work in a muscle physiology lab, but also it's just that muscle is the organ that we would want to improve the mitochondrial function of, because that's our biggest metabolic organ that's going to dictate our metabolic flexibility. So our ability to metabolize glucose and our ability to metabolize fatty acids, depending on the appropriate scenario for each. So if we're trying to improve our metabolic flexibility, our insulin sensitivity, our fat oxidative capacity, we want to improve the mitochondria of our muscle specifically. And so if we're thinking like, oh, fasting, it's being championed as this way to activate the pathways that should lead to greater metabolic flexibility. So metabolic flexibility is also really tied to mitochondrial function. Sorry, I'm going all over the place with what things lead to what, but essentially there's pathways that lead to greater mitochondrial biogenesis, so the accumulation or growth of our mitochondria that should then therefore increase our metabolic flexibility, and we should have greater metabolic health. However, we were aware of research that showed no effect of both short-term and long-term fasting, so long-term up to 48 hours, that these pathways were not being activated in response to fasting in skeletal muscle. And things weren't lining up with the rodent data that we were also aware of that is frequently cited within the literature that you mentioned. So these big nutrition journals, these big metabolism journals and papers and reviews mostly are citing these rodent studies saying that, oh, okay, similar to exercise, you can fast and increase what's called AMPK. So AMP kinase, which is an upstream kinase enzyme that should trigger the activation of these downstream pathways that lead to the increase in mitochondrial proteins. And when you read these reviews, they're good journals, they're amazing researchers who are writing these papers. However, it's rodent data. And so we decided, my supervisor and I, that we needed to systematically assess the literature and figure out what's going on. So we conducted a systematic review. We got every study we could find in rodents, so mice and rats specifically, and humans. And we looked at all fasting durations over 6 hours and included any study that had an AMPK outcome or PGC1 alpha outcome. So PGC1 alpha is termed like the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis, and it's activated by AMPK. Well, one of its activators is AMPK, which is relevant to fasting, that AMPK pathway specifically. And so we found that unlike rodents, which Tommy brought this up on your podcast already, but unlike rodents, humans don't have an increase in AMPK or PGC1 alpha, suggesting that mitochondrial biogenesis is not activated by fasting for up to 72 hours, which is what we had in our study. And in the rodent data, it was just way more inconsistent than what these journals and journal papers are portraying. Like it's really almost stated as fact that, oh, fasting increases AMPK, so we should get all these downstream benefits. But yeah, so our conclusion really was that like the studies that show intermittent fasting and fasting improves health, which I do think it does. Like I'm still a fan of fasting. It's just that it's being inappropriately attributed to something that's not occurring. And then we just have this false sense of what's happening when really it's probably just related to caloric restriction, which is great. If intermittent fasting is working and reducing your caloric intake and you're getting metabolic health benefits because of that, then that's amazing. But we can't say that it's doing something, especially when it's something that someone's substituting for exercise, which we know we have tons of research is going to increase these pathways and lead to health benefits. So if you're substituting in fasting for exercise, I think that that's a potentially dangerous message.
Yeah, I've been on a very similar journey as you have. First, like being so excited by fasting and, the ketogenesis brought on from that and AMPK and mitochondrial biogenesis and then fasted exercise. Like I love doing fasted exercise and then thinking that I'm creating these adaptations during the fasted exercise because of the fasting. Then I read a study that was actually saying that if you consume protein, but you're still not consuming carbohydrate, you still will get similar amounts of mitochondrial biogenesis, even though you're not fasted. And then I started to think maybe, it's more the exercise and not the fasting that's doing the mitochondrial biogenesis. So would you say it's just that you want to think about it in terms of the exercise is going to generate these adaptations that are beneficial for your mitochondria? And it's not so much the fasting. And so if you want to do fasted exercise, fine. But just knowing that that's sort of the mechanism is it's the exercise that's creating those adaptations, not the fasting and the fasted exercise.
Yeah. And like this was like when I realized that reducing energy in is what fasting is doing. So there's this energetic stress signal. Reducing energy in doesn't necessarily induce energetic stress. It's increasing energy expenditure that induces that energetic stress signal because AMPK, its name, like AMP activated kinase, is activated by AMP. And so fasting, reducing energy in, doesn't increase AMP. We have to use ATP to accumulate AMP to activate AMPK. And the only way to do that is to increase energy expenditure, which is exercise. Like that's literally the only physiological state where we're using ATP quicker than we can resynthesize it. So then we get that AMP and ADP accumulation. And that's what's going to trigger these pathways. So it makes sense when you think of it like that that's the only way we're going to get the activation of the AMPK, PGC1 alpha pathway.
Not from the carbohydrate restriction as much and the fasting, because you're not able to replenish the AMP.
Right. Yeah. So we want to like essentially exceed our capacity to resynthesize ATP in order to get those metabolic products built up to activate those pathways in our skeletal muscle. But there is like enough preliminary evidence to suggest that carbohydrate restriction prior to exercise could change the way these pathways are activated by exercise. And that's why I'm studying fasted versus carbohydrate fed exercise to try and, contribute to this literature. We have literature, almost all of the fasted versus fed exercise studies have been done with moderate intensity exercise. So just steady state, maybe 30, 60 minutes of 60% VO2 max. And that changes the fuel utilization that you use during that bout of exercise. So if you wake up in the morning, consume nothing, go and do 60 minutes of continuous exercise, you're going to be burning proportionally more fat during that bout of exercise compared to had you had toast and a banana beforehand. So carbohydrate intake before exercise will increase how much carbohydrates you burn during the exercise afterwards. But what that means for adaptations, it's just a bit unclear because we have conflicting evidence, and it might be related to baseline fitness status. So there's some good research in overweight, potentially insulin resistant, maybe just on the spectrum of insulin resistance, who see greater benefit from doing exercise in the fasted state compared to the fed state. So maybe there is something about the fuels that we use during that bout and the health benefits that we get from exercise could be related to our baseline status. For people who are already relatively fit, whether you work out in the fasted state versus the fed state, whether that improves adaptation, whether that improves health, fitness, etc., I think is a bit less clear. And then what happens when we do this over time with higher intensities, I think is even more less clear, because as we increase intensity, we actually don't burn different fuels, whether you're in the fed or fasted state, because the energy demand of high intensity exercise is so high that we're using intramuscular stores. So we're using muscle glycogen versus at moderate intensities, we're really reliant on our adipose tissue delivering fatty acids to our muscles. And if we're in the carbohydrate fed state, then we have higher insulin, and that could be blunting lipolysis. So we have less free fatty acid availability, and then we have higher blood glucose. We're going to use that glucose. So it's just a very different state depending on intensity, and that might get lost in the conversation as well. So someone doing a fasted CrossFit workout versus a fasted maybe hour on the bike in the morning, that might change whether fasted versus fed exercise is quote unquote better or worse. There's just a lot of nuance. And I think that when we're trying to improve fitness and improve health through exercise, doing exercise, the exercise bout is probably doing 90 to 99% of the heavy lifting. And your pre-exercise nutrition is probably just like trying to get that extra little bit. But I still think it's worth knowing how we could be adapting differently in the fasted versus fed state, which is why I'm studying it. And personally, I work out in the fasted state, so I want to know, and I do high intensity exercise. I mean, these questions have not been answered in the literature, so that's why I'm so obsessed with my research, and I love my PhD experience so far, because I get to just ask questions that have not been answered that could potentially apply to myself.
You guys, is there anything better than going to your favorite steakhouse for a big celebration and having an incredible restaurant quality steak grilled for you to perfection? I know I have my favorite steakhouses, but we usually only do that on special occasions because, let's face it, going to an incredible steakhouse is really not practical every day or even a few times a month. Now, all of that has changed thanks to Schwank Grills. Now, you have to check out this incredible grill that everyone is talking about. The secret to incredible restaurant quality steak is the technology, the grilling technology, and being able to grill on infrared heat up to 1500 degrees. Previously, you could only get that in restaurants, but now, thanks to Schwank Grills, they are changing the game. Their grill gets up to 1500 degrees, so you can get the perfect sear and create a delicious crust on both sides of the steak. That means restaurant quality steaks in the comfort of your own home. This grill is made in the USA and uses the exact same technology as the world's best steakhouses. This is truly the future of grilling, but it's not just for steak. You can also grill chicken wings, burgers, lobster tails, salmon, and more in just minutes, which saves so much time when you have a super busy schedule and just so much going on. Now you can try it out for yourself and get $150 off a Schwank grill. Just visit schwankgrills.com and use the promo code KetogenicGirl to get $150 off your Schwank grill. That's SCHWANK grills.com. Use the promo code KetogenicGirl and get $150 off your Schwank grill today. All of this will be linked in the show notes, so you can click right to it. All right, now back to our show. I really love that. And I'm so glad that you're doing research on this. And I want to circle back to what you're studying in terms of lactate and everything. But I want to talk a little bit about what you've learned in terms of muscle metabolism. But I just wanted to touch on macros real quick and your opinion on that. So it sounds like you've been I feel like I've been on a similar trajectory to yours as I was, reading one of your blogs about like how you eat. Think what you do is similar, but you basically have gone from, doing like all the keto stuff and fasting here and there to just focusing on like optimizing your protein intake, eating whole foods, making sure that you're moving every day, in some way, and if possible with intensity, because the intensity is a great factor on like how much energy disposal you have, and also just all the benefits that we've been talking about. So I've sort of come to the conclusion generally that if you are prioritizing protein, you can kind of choose your own adventure when it comes to like your fuel mix. You're getting, your carbons from either the carbohydrates or the hydrocarbons, and it's whatever works for you at the end of the day, as long as those are mostly coming from whole food sources for the most part, then that's sort of probably going to work for most people. And if you don't overconsume energy and end up with energy toxicity, or you match your consumption of energy with your energy disposal. So is that sort of similar to where you're at now?
Yeah. And I'll give credit to Tommy because he's really kind of changed the trajectory of my own thinking as well, and simplified it for me, because I feel like it's like, okay, what's next? Like, okay, what more could I be doing?
Yeah.
When really the answers are always way more simple than we think, because we almost like want a protocol. Like that's why like these like specific things like zone 2 training and then doing your high intensity intervals once a week, all these like different protocols that we think are like optimal. It's really a lot more simple than that, but we're always like trying to find that exact protocol. But no, yeah, I've landed on a very simple, I guess, dietary philosophy, and it aligns with exactly what you said. It's like, okay, well, if I'm focused on protein intake and then just the rest of my caloric intake comes from whole foods, I feel like I can't screw that up. Like there's no cognitive oversight to my diet when I just stick to those two things. I don't have to think about how much I'm eating. I don't have to think about when I'm eating. I get to just eat when I want, how much I want within that framework. And like, I don't have to stress about anything. And I can eat at a restaurant. I can eat anywhere. If I don't find food, like if there's no food around that I guess like fits those criteria, I don't have to eat. Like I'm not starving. I'm never to the point where I'm like, oh, I'm so hungry, I'll eat whatever. So I think that it's given, not that I ever like was stressed about food, but I definitely thought more about food on a daily basis. But now I'm just kind of, if I can get my protein, the rest kind of falls into place, and I'm not worried about macronutrients because I'm just eating whole food. So like, I'm not worried about how much carbs I'm eating, because how much carbs can you really eat when you're eating basically just meat and vegetables? And like, I have some fruit here and there, but I definitely gravitate towards a low carb diet. And it's just, I think, liberating and freeing not to have to think about food and how much you eat and what you eat. And I think a big part of it, I mean, I have a lot of freedom because I cook my own, like I'm home for dinners. I'm not necessarily like forced to go eat out all the time. So I do have control over my diet, but not keeping packaged food and processed foods in the house. Like I don't keep them in the house. So like those are never really an option. And I think that is a huge thing, like just creating the environment that allows you to naturally stick to the goals or do the actions that get you the outcome that you're trying to get to. If you're just setting up your environment for success, it's so much easier to just like walk through life that way without having to think like, oh, those chips are in the pantry and I really want to eat them. When am I going to be able to give myself permission to eat them? It's like, no, like just don't even give yourself that option.
Yes, I feel the exact same way. And it is so liberating, as you said, so freeing to be able to reclaim that energy that you're putting towards thinking about food and put it towards your projects, your passions, your endeavors, instead of wasting it on something that you really don't need to be putting time and energy to. But I feel the same way as you. If you just structure your food environment, to only have the things that you want to be eating and really prioritize protein leverage, for me, like that concept just made it so simple to understand that if you just prioritize protein, you won't overeat on the energy macros. And once you do that and figure that out, then you don't have to think about the macros as much anymore. You don't have to worry about, are you going to overeat? The chances of not overeating are in your favor, because you now have created like the system where your body's getting what it needs from the protein, that those essential amino acids and also non-essential, which are probably essential too. You're getting all that stuff, and then up front, then you don't have to worry about overeating. And it just naturally, it's self-regulating. It's like, I think of, how animals eat. Like they just eat the protein, like the animals that are carnivorous eat the protein, and then they probably don't think about eating until they get hungry again, right? And that to me is how I feel now. And I attribute that a lot to protein leverage and to trying the carnivore diet. And I know you did that as well. And it just really like to learn that you can get this different kind of satiety, like a nutrient satiety, instead of like a trying to eat all this volume eating plants and like never really feeling that same like level of satiety. It's a game changer. And like, I'm so thankful for learning those concepts, but I love that you've sort of figured that philosophy out for yourself. So keeping all that in mind, knowing that you studied under Dom, and I know you've really been exposed to like the low carb research a lot. What is your opinion on people eating high carb diets, like the standard American diet? Let's say like people eating around 300 grams of carb per day. A lot of that potentially coming from processed foods because, we live in an environment of convenience. If people get their protein in, do you have concerns about those dietary recommendations and the amount of carbohydrate or the amount of processed foods? Like, do you think it could create an environment where people are not as well set up and so they will overeat because perhaps they're not getting their protein needs met because the protein is like the recommendations are so low? Like, do you see any problems with that for people? And like, how can they find their way back to that more like systematic way of eating?
Yeah, I think that just including processed foods in your diet is just inherently going to set you up for failure, because we're not going to be able to, unless you're tracking your caloric and macro intake. I just don't know how you would ever be able to do that naturally day to day, unless you're like a crazy athlete and are training all the time. Then yeah, you can get away with a lot. Like if you're exercising a ton, it allows you a lot of flexibility and freedom with your energy intake and carbohydrate intake. But if you're eating a diet that is promoting overeating and excess caloric intake, then that diet is not good for you. Even if perhaps that was a ketogenic diet where you're now spending hours in the kitchen making fat bombs and different things that cause you to increase your caloric intake, then those foods need to be removed, because no one wants to have to think about that on a day-to-day basis of being like, oh no, I can only have one bite. I think being able to recognize, because we all have a different relationship with food, and some people I think would benefit from like the energy density, like focusing on energy density. And there's more and more research coming out showing that like the energy density is what's the major factor in ad libitum environments and ad libitum food. So if you have unlimited food intake, if there's energy density is high, you're more likely, energy density being like the caloric content versus the volume of food. So vegetables would have a low energy density, whereas processed foods would have a high energy density. If we're just in an unlimited food environment, then those with access to low energy density foods are going to consume less than those who are exposed to high energy density foods, just because we are more likely to overconsume foods that are higher in energy density. But I will push back on this, because for myself, I've given this example before, but if I eat like 800 to 1,000 calories of oxtail, for example, which is super fatty, super energy dense, I don't want to eat for like 24 hours. Yeah. So like, I don't think that rule necessarily always is going to apply, because that will keep me full forever. And it's not a lot of, like on a daily timeline, that's not a lot of calories. But I don't think most people are going to be experimenting necessarily with like carnivore style eating. So on a grand like public health message, it's that we should be reducing the foods that have high energy density that cause overeating. I think recognizing the foods that we cannot control, I think there's like guilt or like shame of being like, oh, I can't, like I have no control around food and that kind of stuff. It's like, no, like everyone probably experiences that with some sort of foods, and I think that we also feel guilty or shame that we'd have to cut foods out, and people are afraid of cutting foods out. But like, honestly, like, why not? Why not just have that? It's not discipline. It's like, why not have that? Just recognizing yourself and be like, you know what? I admit I can't control whenever there's a bag of chips, I eat them and I eat them all. Just admit that and be like, you know what? I'm just going to not eat chips anymore. Instead of trying to like be a hero and be like, you know what? No, next time I'll only eat half the bag. I feel like we need to just accept more, not dietary restrictions per se. Like, I don't think that we should be promoting like orthorexic behaviors, but at the same time, we live in a very obesogenic environment, and acknowledging what tools we have at our disposal and respecting that in other people too. Because I think my experience, and you've probably experienced this as well, people pay attention to what you're doing because they know you're into health. And like, I don't want those eyes on me, and I don't want people questioning me, and I don't want to question other people or make people feel bad or whatever. Everyone needs to be able to feel around for what works for them and what causes them to maintain a healthy body weight, because not gaining weight, one, is a win, just not gaining weight, and then losing weight is even harder. And so I think we just need to accept that we live in a very poor environment that is not conducive to even just not gaining weight, and then figuring out, like, what can we change in our environment? What decisions can we make around food that are going to allow us to not have to have this cognitive oversight on every single thing that we're eating?
Yes, I love the way you put that. And I think if everyone realized that processed foods are literally designed to make you feel unsatisfied, they would stop eating them, I think. Because I've been trying to explain recently to some friends that I have locally who are like not in nutrition space or low carb space at all. And, they're like, why do you eat this way? And I'm like, because prioritizing protein for me, I just eat the food that makes me feel full. So I don't have to think about food and I get on with my day. Whereas when I ate like high carb, like plant-based, lots of processed foods, these foods made me feel unsatisfied. So I was constantly thinking about food and preoccupied with it. So it's like you look at it from a satiety point of view. And that's the way we really should be looking at it. Because you look at like the popularity of GLP-1 and these peptides is like, what it's doing is just making people feel satisfied because they're eating food that is making them feel unsatisfied. So they have to take an injection to make them feel satisfied. But if they changed what they were eating to like whole foods, high protein, they probably wouldn't need to take those peptides, right? Like, I'm not speaking for everyone, but I think a lot of people, they're eating in a way that makes them leaves them wanting. And then they have to compensate with this other external thing. Whereas you could just like correct the basis of it. But I also agree with what you said about shaming, because like I have people constantly around me. They're like, I was on a trip recently and my friends were like, we're going to go get ice cream. Like, just letting you know, like if you guys want to join or not. And I'm like, I don't want people to feel bad eating that stuff around me. I'm like, if you are active all day and like you earn that, go for it. Like, or if it's an occasional thing, like don't feel shame around that because like you're around me. But I really just believe what you were saying earlier. If you add in the appropriate amount of exercise and activity, I think that's been like one of the most fundamental things. Is I really thought, circling back to the insulin sensitivity and metabolic flexibility, I really thought doing low carb and keto for all these years is what corrected my insulin sensitivity. And now I'm realizing, no, it's actually becoming way more active and doing resistance training. That is what has corrected my insulin sensitivity and made me more metabolically flexible, because I've been doing CGM trial now and I'm amazed at how steady my blood sugar is. And I've been testing all these carbs and I'm like, how am I able to handle these carbs? At first I was like, it must have been keto all these years. I'm like, actually, I think it's the activity. I think I now have more glucose disposal, more metabolically active tissue, more metabolic flexibility, which goes back to what you're saying. You really can only get that from the exercise and activity, right?
Yeah. No, 100%. So many things that you just said there that I agree with.
And losing fat mass, I guess, is like a really good place for people to start if they're finding themselves in a situation where their fat cells are getting overfull, they're starting to develop some insulin resistance. Like just losing some fat, doing keto, doing low carb can really help with developing more of that insulin sensitivity through losing some fat. And then you get to a point where you're like, all right, I want to keep going with this. Like, what can I do next? And that next thing, the best thing would probably be to add in the exercise and the resistance training at that point, right?
Yeah. And it's not even just our muscle. Like, yeah, I'm in a muscle physiology lab, so I think very muscle centric, but it's our whole system. It's our cardiovascular system. It's increasing blood flow acutely. Like, we want to increase our capillary density. We want to increase the ability to transport nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. We want to be able to increase our stroke volume. And there's so many things that are overlooked when it comes to exercise. And I think exercise is slowly getting the light it deserves. Like, there's way more talk about exercise and the importance of VO2 max. And so to think that you can only increase your VO2 max through intense training. So it's clear that being almost like our fifth vital sign and being so tightly linked to longevity and it's our strongest predictor of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular related disease. So it's clear that exercise, being the only physiological condition to promote increased VO2 max, is really important to reducing our risk of disease and improving our longevity. I think the conversation's changing from like, I need to lose weight, so I'm going to start exercising more. It's like, no, you want to be healthy, so you should start exercising more. It's not about weight loss. Like, trying to lose weight through exercise alone would require a lot of exercise. Like, diet is what's going to really pull. I mean, you could do it. It really is just increasing energy expenditure versus decreasing energy input. But it's much easier to not have that handful of almonds than it is to go expend 300 to 400 calories. So you have a lot more control over the energy intake portion of the equation, but we need that energy expenditure to promote those other health benefits that go beyond weight loss.
Yes, I totally agree with that. We talk a little bit about keto and muscle metabolism. I know you're sort of a little bit further removed now from the keto world, but I know you did write a lot of these blogs, and I know there are studies showing that ketones, when paired with exercise, can have some really interesting benefits and protective effects as well. Do you still take like MCT oil powder from time to time, or MCT oil, or like, when is the last time you had ketones?
Yeah, I mean, I do have MCT powder almost every single day. And because I have the devices in the lab, I measure my ketones here and there. And I'm in ketosis a lot just because I naturally follow a low carb diet, and I usually don't eat until like noon, and I'm exercising in the fasted state. So post exercise, I can get my ketones pretty high being in the fasted state. So yeah, I still feel like I followed the exact same lifestyle as I did before. It's just the reasons for doing it are very different now. Not very different, but I'm not convinced I'm doing it for certain reasons than I am. But yeah, so I am measuring breath acetone in my participants. And maybe if there's different adaptations in the fasted versus fed state, and I look at breath acetone levels and I'm like, oh, all of my participants were in ketosis, that would be an interesting finding for sure. But we'll see. I don't really know. But yeah, like, when it comes to ketones, I don't necessarily think of muscle health per se, although there's totally a whole realm of research on that as well, in terms of like preventing sarcopenia and having that muscle sparing effect, or cancer cachexia. And yeah, I think there's utility in ketones when it comes to muscle health. It's just not necessarily that applicable to, well, it could be applicable to my research too. I just am unfortunately not really studying that, because it would be really cool to look at all these epigenetic changes in beta hydroxybutyrate as an epigenetic marker. So the beta hydroxybutyrylation, which it literally binds to our histones and changes the expression of genes. So back to what you were saying about signaling molecules. Ketones are really cool. It's just, unfortunately, it's not been part of what I'm directly studying. But I think that there is something there, and it could be related to our adaptations to exercise. And who knows, maybe people are getting this even on a higher carb diet, or including carbs and not on a ketogenic diet, because of post-exercise ketosis. So maybe we are just, I think a lot of people are going into ketosis a lot more than we think. A lot of my participants come in after like a 12-hour fast, and sometimes their breath acetone, if their ratio is equivalent, sometimes their blood beta hydroxybutyrate is estimated at like 2 after a 12-hour fast or something. I'm like, these university students are extremely, if we're going to say metabolically flexible, they're able to get into ketosis really rapidly. And I bet you most people are like young, active people are getting into ketosis more than they think, even without deliberately restricting carbohydrates.
Yes, I was just reading about some of that in Alex Leaf's. He did this paper, I guess it was a position stand on ketogenic diets and athletes and how they'll get into post-exercise ketosis, which was really interesting, and get the sort of like backup of ketones. But I, very similar to you, do fasted exercise, usually fast until like midday or like 1 or 2. I test my breath acetone on my ketone device, and I'm in ketosis a lot just from that and doing low carb, even though the protein is a bit higher. And one of the things I was talking about with Alex that was really interesting in his paper is he was saying that people who are doing high protein and who are athletic or who do a lot of regular exercise, more of the protein that you eat is going to your muscle, et cetera. And so less is then potentially kicking out of ketosis, or like you're going to be oxidizing it less. So really interestingly, if you are more athletic and you eat higher protein, you can get into ketosis much more easily, which is just what you were saying. And we talked about it a couple weeks ago on the podcast. So it was a really, really interesting paper. But I agree. I think a lot of people are getting into it probably a lot more often than they realize, especially if they're not eating processed foods and they're active and maybe just spontaneously fasting throughout the day and like not snacking.
Right. Yeah. And I guess I wanted to bring up too, like when I think about ketones and stuff, I do think about it more from like a brain health and whole systemic perspective. And I do deliberately, like I use MCTs because I'm like, oh, I want to get into ketosis in the morning. And the state of the literature is compelling enough for me to want to derive benefits from ketones and ketone metabolism. So I'm definitely not shifted outside of the realm of ketones or changed my mind on them at all. It's just that it's, I guess, from the metabolic flexibility perspective, I'm not as bought into the whole fasting stuff anymore.
Yes. And then I think that's great to understand. And I do it for the same reason. Like there's lots of research showing that in rodents anyway, and I know in some humans now they're starting to look at, but there's increased mitochondrial content in the brain when you're having ketones and enhancing brain metabolism. But I notice a huge effect on my cognition because I just don't get as much sleep as I used to with having babies. And it's just so helpful, like when I'm working or before podcasting. And I used to always be like, no, like my body will make the ketones. But now I'm like, no, I'll just drink the ketones. And it's super helpful. So I'd love to talk about the research that you're working on right now with lactate. Like, what is lactate? What should people know about lactate? And what are you hoping to find in your research?
Yeah. So, okay, I'll explain a lactate threshold test. So a lactate threshold test is a incremental graded exercise test that starts at a very low intensity and increases in intensity every 3 to 5 minutes, because that's how long it takes for blood lactate to start to stabilize. And so we measure blood lactate after every 5-minute increment of increasing resistance. And then you can see it, you can graph the lactate against exercise intensity or the power output on a bike, for example. As you're increasing intensity, blood lactate will eventually start to accumulate in the blood. And that just means that our muscles are producing lactate at a rate that's exceeding its clearance. So now, because we're always producing and we're always clearing lactate, and the net amount in our blood is what we're measuring. Same with glucose. Everything is flux. We always have to think of things in flux. So lactate is produced when we burn carbohydrates. So as our muscles are metabolizing glucose, we're making lactate at the same time as we're making pyruvate. Pyruvate gets shuttled, though, into the mitochondria to undergo oxidation, whereas lactate could be used as a fuel, but it's also just exported into the blood and then taken up by other tissues. So at a certain exercise intensity, our blood lactate will rise above our baseline level. Our baseline level is around 1. Once it reaches about 2, that's considered our lactate threshold, or lactate threshold 1. And then after 2, it kind of starts to increase exponentially. So it's like a flat line, a little bit tick up, and then exponential increase. And as you increase intensity. And so I think lactate is really cool because it's almost like a window into the bioenergetics of our skeletal muscle. And the more fit you are, the longer you can exercise in that graded exercise test, the higher intensity you can exercise at with a lower blood lactate. And so it's a way of basically assessing training. So if you did measured lactate, a lactate threshold pre-training, and then trained for 6 weeks, and then you measured it again, you should be able to work out at a higher intensity at a lower blood lactate level, or your lactate hits 2 millimolar, or your lactate threshold is now at a higher exercise intensity. And that tells us a lot about what's going on in the muscle, because that means that we're burning more lipids at a higher intensity now than we were pre-training, which could tell us that our mitochondria have become more efficient, or maybe we induce some mitochondrial biogenesis and we're able to oxidize more fuels and more lipids before having to switch into that carb burning state as we increase intensity. Because the way exercise intensity determines fuel substrate utilization is that we increase fat oxidation as we start exercising at a low intensity. Fat oxidation goes up until a certain point, and then it starts going down as carbohydrate oxidation is increasing. And so we can almost use lactate to kind of see like, okay, well, what point does that occur at? So I think lactate's really cool. And because it's now more and more research is coming out suggesting that lactate is a signaling molecule as well, similar to ketones and beta hydroxybutyrate. And like lactate is metabolized by the brain. It might be doing other signaling roles in the body. So not only that would suggest that a higher lactate level is good, and we want to be working out at high intensities to be spitting lactate into our blood. But also, if we want to be fitter, we want a lower blood lactate level at higher intensities. But that could just be a way to assess your lactate level and your fitness level, similar to a VO2 max. So physiology, things change in concert. So if we're training in a way that increases our VO2 max, that training should also be increasing our lactate threshold. It should be increasing our capillarization. It should be associated with increased mitochondrial biogenesis. It should be like all of these things should be occurring in parallel, because we're trying to basically expand the efficiency of our whole system. So we like to think of things as like very separate. And even in academia, like we have a cardiovascular lab, we have a hypertrophy lab, we have a endurance lab, like we have all these like very specific outcomes that different labs are working on. But really, I think they're all just happening in concert as we become more trained. But anyways, moral of that story is that I'm using lactate and lactate threshold specifically in my research as my outcome of interest, just because I think it is this window into the bioenergetics of our skeletal muscle. And then I'm also going to be looking at mitochondrial content, different mitochondrial, like markers of mitochondrial biogenesis. So if those things are increasing in concert with lactate threshold, then we're creating more of a story for what are these underlying determinants of our lactate threshold.
It's so interesting, because I remember Dom saying to me a few years ago that he wanted to study lactate more. And it was like really interesting. And he also mentioned some other citric acid cycle intermediates that he thought were really interesting and should like warranted more research. So that it's so cool to see you actually doing it right now. You're actually studying it right now. So if I understand you correctly, basically, if you produce less lactate over time of the exercise, you're relying more on fat. So if your lactate threshold increases and you have less of it after training, then your fat oxidation capacity increased, and therefore your mitochondrial capacity has increased. And that, by your definition, means you're more fit. So it's sort of like lactate threshold is a proxy for, is it your body's ability to start depositing more fat in the muscle?
I mean, the more trained you are, the more you store intramuscular triglycerides, because we want them in close proximity to our mitochondria. But I want to disclaim that these are just like, it's suggesting that they are associated. But yes, so like if we're producing less lactate, that means that we're burning less glucose. So that means that we're burning more fat to essentially, that's where the energy is being provided by. So it can almost tell us fuel substrate utilization without having to wear a mask on your face and have a metabolic cart. And if it is associated, so my next study will be looking at Okay, so I'm taking overweight and lean individuals, active and less active individuals, and then I'm taking blood, going to be looking at their glucose tolerance. I'm doing OGTTs, looking at their metabolic health status, and then I'll look at their lactate threshold, and then I'll be looking at their mitochondrial content and function markers of both, depending on how you define those terms, and seeing like, okay, so is lactate threshold predictive of what our mitochondria look like in our skeletal muscle? And is this related to our metabolic health? So I think that that would be a really cool, like non-invasive way to assess skeletal muscle health across different metabolic health status and activity levels, because I think it could predict. Well, that's what it is suggested within the literature to be almost this indirect marker. Lactate threshold is suggested to be an indirect marker of mitochondrial function. It's just never really been tested directly.
That's so neat. It's so fun to be doing that kind of research. And it makes me think of this. I don't know if you heard the Dr. Peter Attia Drive episode with Dr. Luc Van Loon. And he was talking about how
I haven't heard.
It's I've listened to it like 20 times already since it came out. But it's this one part where he talks about looking at the mitochondria under a microscope, and they have these little fat droplets like backpacks. So it's like these tiny mitochondria with their little like fat backpacks.
So funny.
Yeah, and like I guess like the more fit you get, the more, like you were saying, the fat deposits or droplets are closer to the mitochondria, so they can access them more, and you have that higher turnover.
Turnover is the key word there,
right?
Because
athletes'
metabolic
paradox.
syndrome and type 2 diabetes would be associated with lipid droplets as well. It's just they're stagnant and probably not in the right spot.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the athlete's paradox is super interesting. I can't wait to see the results and see what research you continue to come out with. Now, just as we are wrapping up, what are some tips you can leave our listeners with, in terms of how they can improve their metabolic flexibility? I know we've covered a lot of it initially, but just to sort of recap in all the things that you've been researching and learning. And I know you've changed your mind on things and everything. So it's great to maybe leave listeners with some like, top tips or key points, takeaways that they can have.
Okay. Well, I think we talked about the diet stuff. So yeah, like prioritizing protein and then figuring out what foods prevent you from overeating and maintaining a healthy body weight. I think that's really important. And then when it comes to exercise, I think intensity is very important. So the less time we're going to spend doing exercise, the more we should be focusing on intensity. So depending on how much time you have in a day, if you're going to only work out for 30 minutes a day, then intensity should be prioritized over lower intensities. Resistance training is obviously super important, and you've probably had many guests on talking about the importance of building lean muscle mass, which is of course going to improve our metabolic capacity and our metabolic, just the amount of muscle we have to be able to promote those adaptations that endurance training would do differentially. So I guess key takeaways: eat in a way that doesn't promote excess body fat, and resistance training to build muscle, and focus on intensity if you're going to be doing endurance exercise.
Yeah, the intensity piece I think is really interesting and a great way to get the most out of your workouts. And I know there's more talk about exercise snacks, like Dr. Rhonda Patrick has, talked about those, and like just doing 10 squats every hour can have an amazing impact on your glucose control.
Yeah, that's so John Little, who I brought up earlier from UBC Okanagan, he's really spearheaded the exercise snack literature as well. So you could talk to him about ketones and inflammation and exercise snacks.
I can't wait. I'm going to reach out to him right after this for sure. And I love that he's, I also went to UBC, so it'll be fun to connect with him on that. But thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know you're super busy with your PhD, and really excited to see your research as it comes out and continue to follow your career. Where can everyone, I guess, connect with you online if you are, sharing? Is there any place in particular where you're sharing your insights and research with everyone?
I've definitely lowered the volume of my voice over these past few years since starting my PhD, but you can find me on Instagram. That's probably where I'm the most active. I think my name is just Kristi Storoschuk. And I have a website that I don't update, but you can contact me through that website if you wanted to reach out. But also you can just reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm on social media. I'm just less active these days.
Yeah. Awesome.
But thank you so much for having me on. This was truly an honor and a pleasure to meet you and connect. And,
you too.
I had a lot of fun. So I really appreciate the invite.
Awesome. Yeah, it's so fun to talk about all these topics and help share the research that you're putting out there. It's really important and going to help change the way that people approach healthy lifestyle and their metabolic flexibility and knowing what it really is.
I hope I clarified some things. I don't know if I confuse more people than I helped, but
all right, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Kristi. I love the research and work that she is doing. She really is doing some very exciting research, and it's so exciting whenever we get to talk directly with scientists who are in their labs every day, actively working on bringing these new findings to us that ultimately will serve us. And the data being collected and analyzed is going to be helpful to serve humanity in terms of how can we optimize mitochondrial function, metabolic health, metabolic flexibility, and all of these different approaches and protocols. And I love getting to talk to her about the key principles in terms of maintaining and improving metabolic health and metabolic flexibility and mitochondrial biogenesis as well. So I love that we got to define some of these key terms. I think this is a super important episode, and I would absolutely love to hear any takeaways that you had from the episode. Please do share them with us in the Optimal Protein Podcast group on Facebook. You can join us there for more discussion on these topics or to ask questions, submit questions for the podcast, or just to interact with this community and other members of this amazing family. So you can join us on Facebook and the Optimal Protein Podcast. So Kristi is actually using breath acetone in the study that she's doing right now, and she is measuring levels of ketosis with her participants using breath acetone, which is exactly what I do myself and what you can do in the comfort of your home with the Tone device. The Tone device is a device that I created, and I just launched the new second generation of it. And you can use it to test your breath acetone, to test your ketones and see where you are at in terms of your level of fat burning and your level of ketosis. We talked about some of the benefits of ketones as signaling molecules today on the episode. And it really, I think, is very beneficial if you are someone who wants to ultimately improve your mitochondrial health, to get into ketosis at least once in a while. You can do it with a low carb approach, with doing intermittent fasting. You can also get into it with a lot of athleticism or exercise. So there's lots of different things that you can measure using the Tone device. And all you need to do is breathe into it for 4 to 5 seconds instead of having to painfully prick your finger every time and use those very expensive and wasteful test strips. All you need to do is use your breath, and you can test an unlimited amount of times. So you can check out the Tone device at ketogenicgirl.com, and feel free to send me a message if you have any questions. We talked a lot about optimizing mitochondrial health, and another way to do that is with red light therapy. And you can check out my line of red light therapy panels as well at ketogenicgirl.com. It's called the Tone Luxe Collection. I have several high-powered, amazing red light therapy panels there, as well as the brand new Crystal Mask, which is a hands-free way to do red light therapy and stay really consistent with it. I love using it because I'm able to still do things while I'm getting my red light therapy in, and it is super, super helpful for that. So you can check that all out at ketogenicgirl.com. Thank you all so much for listening, for tuning in today, and for being here. I appreciate you all so much. And until the next episode, I'm wishing you a fat-filled rest of your day. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.
A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with the ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown, so you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian.